a journey through the American West.
Before we begin tonight's gentle journey, please take a moment to check that you are subscribed, so you will never miss the next story. And write in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time is on your clock. Thank you.
In the vast expanse of the American continent, where the eastern forest gradually gave way to rolling plains and endless grasslands, there existed a time and place that would forever capture the imagination of the world. This was the American West, a land of incredible distances where the skies stretched from one horizon to the other like a great blue dome, unbroken by mountains or tall buildings. The period we speak of lasted roughly from the end of the Civil War in 1865 until the closing of the frontier around 1890, though its influence and memory would linger far beyond those dates. The air in these western territories carried a different quality than that of the settled eastern states. It was dry and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush, wild grass, and the earthy smell of cattle. When the wind blew across the prairie, which it did almost constantly, it created a soft whisper that could be heard for miles, a gentle sound that spoke of vast open spaces and freedom from the crowded cities of the East. The landscape itself was a study in subtle beauty. The Great Plains stretched endlessly in all directions, covered in native grasses that swayed in the persistent breeze like waves on a green ocean. Buffalo grass, blue grama, and western wheatgrass created a carpet that changed color with the seasons, bright green in spring, golden in summer, and burnished bronze in autumn. Scattered across the sea of grass were occasional islands of cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling with sound like gentle applause whenever the wind touched them. The sky in the west was a character unto itself, vast and ever-changing. During the day, it presented an endless canopy of blue, often dotted with high, white clouds that cast moving shadows across the prairie. These shadows would drift slowly across the grassland, creating patterns of light and dark that shifted, constantly but peacefully. As evening approached, the western sky would begin its daily transformation into a canvas of colors, first pale yellow, then orange, then deep red and purple, finally fading to the deep blue-black of night filled with more stars than eastern dwellers had ever imagined possible. This was a world into which a unique breed of men and women ventured, seeking opportunity, adventure, or simply a new way of life far from constraints of civilized society. The West represented something fundamental to the American spirit, the idea that there was always somewhere else to go, always new land to explore, always another chance to start fresh. It was a land that demanded resilience, resourcefulness, and a certain acceptance of solitude, for the distances between settlements were vast, and help, when needed, was often days or weeks away. The climate of the western plains was as distinctive as its landscape. Summers could be blazingly hot, with temperatures soaring well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while winters brought bitter cold and fierce blizzards that could last for days. Spring and autumn were often brief, transitional seasons that could change from mild and pleasant to harsh and dangerous within the span of a single day. Rain was precious and often scarce, leading to drought conditions that could last for months or even years. When storms did come, they often arrived with dramatic intensity, great thunderheads building up during the afternoon heat, then unleashing torrential downpours, lightning, and sometimes devastating hail. Yet for all its challenges, the West possessed an undeniable beauty and a sense of freedom that drew people from across the nation and around the world. It was a place where a person could ride for days without seeing another human being, where the night sky was so clear and dark that the Milky Way appeared as a bright river of stars stretching across the heavens, and where the sunrise and sunset painted the entire world in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. The cowboy, perhaps the most iconic figure of the American West, did not spring into existence fully formed. Rather, this unique profession evolved gradually from a combination of necessity, geography, and cultural influences that came together in the decades following the Civil War. The roots of cowboy culture can be traced back to the Spanish colonization of Mexico and the American Southwest, where vaqueros, skilled horsemen who managed cattle on vast ranches, had been perfecting the techniques of horseback cattle handling for over 2 centuries. When American settlers began moving into Texas and other southwestern territories, they encountered these established ranching traditions and adapted them to their own needs and circumstances. The word cowboy itself was initially somewhat derogatory, referring to young men or boys who worked with cattle, but over time it evolved into a term of respect for skilled horsemen and cattle handlers. The typical cowboy of the late 1800s was often a young man, usually between the ages of 16 and 30, though some continued in profession well into their later years. Many were veterans of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate, who found themselves displaced and seeking new opportunities in the aftermath of that great conflict. Others were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries, drawn by the promise of work and adventure in the American West. A significant number were African American, including many former slaves who have found freedom and opportunity in the cattle industry, and Mexican vaqueros who brought centuries of experience to the ranches of Texas and beyond. The daily life of a cowboy was governed by the rhythms of the cattle and the demands of the ranch. A typical day began well before dawn, often around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, when the cook would begin preparing breakfast and coffee. The sound of metal pots and pans clanging together, the crackle of a fire being built up, and the rich aroma of strong coffee brewing would gradually rouse the sleeping cowboys from their bedrolls. The first task of each day was to check on the cattle, a process that required mounting their horses while it was still dark and riding out to wherever the herd had settled for the night. Cowboys developed an intimate knowledge of cattle behavior, understanding that the animals would naturally drift with the wind and would seek shelter in draws and valleys during storms. They could read the signs of prairie, the way grass was bent, the pattern of hoof prints in the dirt, the calls of birds, to track and locate their charges. Morning coffee was a sacred ritual among cowboys. The brew was typically strong enough, as they said, to float a horseshoe made in large pots over an open fire and served in tin cups that retained heat poorly, but were unbreakable and practical for life on the range. Coffee was often the only hot beverage available for days or weeks at a time, and cowboys would nurse their cups slowly, savoring both the warmth and the caffeine that would sustain them through the long day ahead. Breakfast was usually a simple affair consisting of beans, biscuits, salt pork or beef, and sometimes eggs when they were available. The ranch cook, often called Cookie, regardless of his actual name, was a figure of considerable importance and influence. A good cook could make the difference between a content crew and a rebellious one, and experienced cooks often commanded wages nearly equal to those of the ranch foreman. The cook's domain was the chuck wagon, a mobile kitchen and supply depot. that could be moved as needed to support the cowboys wherever their work took them. Life on the ranch, a world of routine and rhythm. Ranch life in the American West was characterized by its adherence to routine, though the specific tasks and challenges could vary dramatically with the seasons, weather, and the needs of the cattle. The ranch itself was typically centered around a cluster of buildings that served various practical purposes. The main house where the ranch owner lived, a bunkhouse for the cowboys, a cookhouse, barns for storing hay and equipment, and corrals for holding and sorting cattle. The bunkhouse was the cowboys' home away from home, a long, low building with small windows and a simple interior furnished with narrow beds, a few chairs, and perhaps a table for card games or writing. Letters. The walls were usually bare wood, sometimes chinked with mud or clay to keep out the wind, and the floor was often just packed earth. Each cowboy had space for his personal belongings, which were typically few: an extra set of clothes, perhaps a book or two, a harmonica or other small musical instrument, and whatever keepsakes he might carry from his previous life. The daily routine of ranch work varied with the seasons. Spring brought the calving season, when cowboys would spend long hours riding to the herds, checking on pregnant cows and assisting with difficult births when necessary. The arrival of new calves was always a time of both joy and anxiety, as the success of the ranch depended largely on the survival rate of the young cattle. Cowboys learned to recognize the signs of impending birth and knew when to intervene and when to let nature take its course. Spring was also the time for branding, a necessary but labor-intensive process that required the cooperation of the entire ranch crew. The cattle would be gathered into corrals where cowboys working in teams would rope, throw, and hold each animal, while a hot iron bearing the ranch's distinctive mark was applied to its hide. The smell of burning hair and flesh, while unpleasant, was an integral part of ranch life, and the sound of cattle lowing and men shouting instructions filled the air during branding season. Summer brought different challenges and opportunities. The grass was at its best during the early summer months, and cattle would be moved to different pastures to take advantage of the best grazing. This process, called turning out the cattle, required cowboys to know intimately every section of the ranch's territory, understanding which area provided the best grass, the most reliable water sources, and the safest terrain for both cattle and horses. The heat of summer could be oppressive, with temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit for days at a time. Cowboys learned to start their work early in the morning and late in the evening, taking shelter during the hottest part of the day whenever possible. They developed a practical approach to deal with the heat: loose-fitting clothes, wide-brimmed hats to provide shade, and the discipline to drink water regularly even when they didn't feel thirsty. Autumn was perhaps the most active time on the ranch, as this was when the cattle were gathered for the great trail drives that would take them to market. The roundup was a complex operation that required careful planning and coordination. Cowboys would spread out across vast areas of rangeland, slowly and methodically gathering cattle from draws, valleys, and scattered grazing areas, bringing them together into increasingly large herds that would eventually be ready for the journey to railroad towns hundreds of miles away. Winter brought its own set of challenges. The grass died back, and cattle had to be moved to areas where hay had been cut and stored, or to sheltered valleys where they could find some protection from the harsh winds and snow. Cowboys spent long days in the saddle, even in bitter cold, checking on the herds and ensuring that the animals had access to water, which often meant breaking ice on ponds and streams. The horses were as much a part of ranch life as the cattle themselves. Each cowboy typically had a string of horses, usually between 6 and 10 animals, each selected for specific qualities and abilities. Some horses were better for long-distance riding. Others excelled at the quick turns and sudden stops required for cutting cattle out of herd, and still others were particularly good at standing quietly while their rider worked with a rope or performed other tasks requiring steady concentration. The relationship between a cowboy and his horses was one of mutual dependence and often genuine affection. Cowboys spent many hours each day in saddle, and a good horse could mean the difference between success and failure, safety and danger. They learned to read their horses' moods and capabilities as carefully as they read the weather or the behavior of cattle. And many cowboys could tell stories about horses that had saved their lives or helped them through difficult situations. Evening on the ranch brought a welcome respite from the day's labors. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red, cowboys would return to the ranch buildings where they would tend to their horses, ensuring that the animals were properly fed, watered, and cared for before seeing to their own needs. The evening meal was often the most social time of the day, when the crew would gather around a cookhouse table or, in good weather, outside around a fire, sharing stories, discussing the next day's work, and enjoying a hot meal after a long day in the saddle. The cook prepared meals that were simple but filling, designed to provide the energy and nutrition needed for physical labor. Beef was naturally plentiful on a ranch, often supplemented by beans, potatoes, biscuits, and whatever vegetables might be available. Coffee remained a constant, served at every meal and often consumed throughout the day. The evening meal was typically followed by a period of relaxation during which cowboys might play cards, write letters to family back east, mend equipment, or simply sit and watch the stars emerge in the clear western sky. Journeys across the endless prairie. The great trail drives of the American West were epic journeys that took herds of cattle from the ranches of Texas and other southwestern territories to the railroad towns of Kansas, Nebraska, and other northern states. These drives were massive undertakings that required careful planning, experienced leadership, and a crew of skilled cowboys who could handle the many challenges and dangers that arose during weeks or months on the trail. A typical trail drive might involve anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 head of cattle, though some of the larger drives included even more animals. The herd would be accompanied by a crew of cowboys, usually one man for every 200 to 300 head of cattle, along with trail boss, who served as leader and decision maker for the entire expedition, a cook with his chuck wagon, and a horse wrangler who was responsible for the remuda, the herd of horses that accompanied the drive. The most famous of the cattle trails was the Chisholm Trail, which ran from Texas through Oklahoma and into Kansas, ending at railroad towns such as Abilene, Ellsworth, and Dodge City. Other important routes included the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and the Shawnee Trail, each with its own characteristics, challenges, and destinations. Preparing for a trail drive was a complex process that began weeks before the actual departure. Cowboys would spend days gathering cattle from across the ranch's territory, bringing them together into a single, large herd that could be managed more easily during the long journey ahead. The animals had to be sorted and counted, with older, more experienced cattle placed strategically within the herd to provide leadership and stability for the younger animals. The chuck wagon was loaded with supplies that would sustain the crew for the duration of the drive: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and whatever other provisions could be obtained. The cook was responsible not only for preparing meals, but also for serving as the expedition's doctor, treating injuries and illnesses with whatever remedies he might have learned over the years. Many cooks carried a basic assortment of medicines and supplies, bandages, liniment for sore muscles, and various potions and powders that were believed to cure common ailments. Once the drive began, life settled into a routine dictated by the needs of the cattle and the demands of the trail. The herd would typically be moved during the early morning and late afternoon hours, when temperatures were cooler and the animals were more comfortable. During the heat of midday, the cattle would be allowed to rest and graze, while the cowboys took shelter as best they could and tried to conserve their energy for the work ahead. The pace of a cattle drive was necessarily slow and steady. Cattle cannot be rushed without losing weight and condition, and a herd pushed too hard will arrive at its destination in poor shape, bringing a lower price at market. A typical day's progress might cover 10 to 15 miles, though this could vary significantly depending on the terrain, weather, and condition of the grass and water along the route. Water was always a primary concern during trail drives. Cowboys had to plan their route carefully to ensure that the herd would have access to adequate water sources every day. Rivers, streams, and natural springs were marked on the mental maps that experienced trail bosses carried in their heads, and the success or failure of a drive could depend on finding water when and where it was needed. During dry periods, cowboys might have to dig wells or travel many extra miles to reach a reliable water source. The evenings on the trail had their own special character. As the sun set and the temperature began to cool, the herd would be allowed to settle for the night in a suitable location, preferably an area with good grass, access to water, and natural barriers that would help contain the cattle should they become restless during the night. The chuck wagon would be positioned where it could serve the evening meal and provide a focal point for the camp. Night herding was one of the most demanding and, in some ways, most peaceful aspects of trail drive life. Cowboys worked in shifts, slowly riding around the sleeping herd to keep watch for any signs of trouble. Cattle were generally calm during the night, but they could be startled by sudden noises, lightning, or other disturbances, and a stampede in the darkness was one of the most dangerous situations that could arise on a trail drive. Many cowboys developed a habit of singing or humming while they rode night herd, not for entertainment, but as a way of keeping the cattle calm and letting them know that their guardians were nearby. The sound of a human voice, low and steady, seemed to have a soothing effect on the animals, and many traditional cowboy songs evolved from these nighttime serenades to sleeping cattle. The weather was always a factor that could dramatically affect the progress and safety of a trail drive. Thunderstorms were particularly dangerous, not only because of the lightning and heavy rain, but because they could spook the cattle and cause a stampede. Cowboys learned to read the signs of approaching weather, watching cloud formations and wind patterns with the same attention that sailors gave to the sea. River crossings presented another significant challenge. Many of the trails led across rivers that were deep, wide, and often running high with spring snowmelt or recent rainfall. Cowboys had to know how to encourage reluctant cattle into the water and keep them moving across in an orderly fashion, while managing horses that might be equally reluctant to enter the rushing water. Tools of the trade, the cowboys' essential equipment. The working cowboy's equipment was carefully chosen for practicality, durability, and versatility. Every item he carried had to earn its place by serving multiple purposes or being absolutely essential to his work with cattle and horses. The cowboy's gear evolved over time through trial and error, with successful innovations being quickly adopted throughout the profession, while impractical items were discarded. The most important piece of equipment, after his horse, was undoubtedly the cowboy's rope. Known as a lariat or lasso, this was typically a 30-foot length of hemp or later manila rope, carefully maintained and coiled with practiced precision. The rope served numerous functions: catching cattle, securing loads, making emergency repairs to equipment, and even serving as a lifeline in dangerous situations. A skilled cowboy could throw his rope with remarkable accuracy, catching a moving steer by the horns or hind legs from horseback at a full gallop. The art of roping was one that required years to master and constant practice to maintain. Cowboys spent countless hours perfecting their technique, learning to build and throw different types of loops for various situations. A loop for catching a calf was different from one used for a full-grown bull, and the technique for roping on foot differed from that used while mounted on a horse. The rope had to be kept clean and dry to maintain its strength and flexibility, and cowboys would often spend their leisure time working with their ropes, practicing knots and loops even when there was no immediate need for these skills. The cowboy saddle was equally important and represented a significant investment. A good saddle might cost the equivalent of several months' wages, but it was expected to last for many years with proper care. Western saddles were designed specifically for working with cattle, featuring a prominent horn at the front that could be used to secure a rope when holding a roped animal, and a high cantle at the back that provided support during long hours in the saddle. The leather of a well-made saddle was thick and durable, able to withstand the strain of a rope bull trying to break free, or the constant rubbing and wear of daily use. Cowboys learned to care for their saddles meticulously, cleaning and oiling the leather regularly to keep it supple and strong. A saddle that was properly maintained could be passed down from one cowboy to another, and many carried the marks and scars of years of hard use. Spurs were another essential piece of equipment, though their use was more subtle than popular. Imagination might suggest good cowboys used spurs not to inflict pain on their horses, but as a means of fine communication, using gentle pressure to signal their mounts to move in specific ways or to respond more quickly to commands. The sound of spurs was as much a part of cowboy culture as any other element. The soft chinking of metal against metal as a cowboy walked, creating a distinctive rhythm that could be heard and recognized from a considerable distance. The cowboy's hat served multiple practical purposes beyond its role as a symbol of the profession. The wide brim provided essential protection from the intense sun of the western plains, while the crown could be shaped to channel rainwater away from the wearer's face and neck. Hats were often used to carry water for a horse, to fan a fire into life, or to signal other cowboys at a distance. The felt from which most cowboy hats were made was durable and water-resistant, able to hold its shape despite constant exposure to sun, rain, and wind. Boots were designed for function rather than fashion, though they certainly developed their own distinctive style over time. The high tops protected the cowboy's legs from brush, rocks, and the occasional snake, while the pointed toes made it easier to slip feet quickly into stirrups. The heels were designed to prevent the foot from sliding too far through the stirrup, which could lead to a dangerous Situation if the rider were thrown from his horse. A cowboy's clothing was similarly practical. Pants were often made of sturdy denim or canvas materials that could withstand the constant rubbing against saddle leather and the thorns and brush encountered while working cattle. Shirts were usually made of cotton or wool, depending on the season, and were cut loose enough to allow freedom of movement while providing protection from sun and wind. Bandanas served multiple purposes, protecting the neck from sun and wind, filtering dust when pulled up over the nose and mouth, and serving as a washcloth, bandage, or signaling device when needed. The cowboys' firearms were tools of necessity rather than instruments of violence, though they certainly could serve the latter purpose when required. A rifle was primarily used for hunting game to supplement the limited diet available on the trail, and for dealing with predators that might threaten the cattle or horses. The revolver that many cowboys carried was useful for a variety of tasks: dispatching injured animals, signaling over long distances, and providing person protection in the rough towns that sprang up along the cattle trails. Knives were among the most versatile tools in the cowboy's kit. A good knife could be used for everything from cutting rope and preparing food to performing basic veterinary procedures on horses and cattle. Many cowboys carried multiple knives: a large, heavy blade for general work and a smaller, sharper knife for more delicate tasks. The chuck wagon represented a mobile base of operations that could support a crew of cowboys for weeks at a time. These wagons were marvels of efficient design, with every inch of space carefully utilized to store the maximum amount of supplies and equipment. The cook's domain included not only food and cooking implements, but also basic medical supplies, tools for wagon repair, and various items that might be needed for the daily maintenance of equipment and gear. The golden dreams of distant mountains. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 set off one of the most dramatic mass migrations in American history, drawing hundreds of thousands of people to the Western territories in search of instant wealth. While the California gold rush was the most famous, it was followed by similar discoveries in Colorado, Nevada, Montana, the Dakotas, and other western regions, each sparking its own wave of hopeful prospectors and the communities that grew up to serve them. The typical gold seeker, often called a 49er after the peak year of the California rush, was usually an ordinary person drawn by the promise of riches that seemed attainable to anyone willing to work hard and endure the hardships of frontier life. These were farmers from the Midwest, clerks from eastern cities, immigrants fresh off the boat from Europe, and former soldiers looking for a new start after the Mexican-American War, or later, the Civil War. The journey to the gold fields was itself an epic undertaking. Those coming from the Eastern United States typically face a choice between a dangerous sea voyage around Cape Horn or across the Panama Isthmus, or the long overland trek across the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, and Western deserts. Each route had its own challenges and dangers, and many who set out for the gold fields never arrived, falling victim to disease, accident, or the simple hardships of travel. In the mid-19th century, the overland route, which many cowboys would later follow in reverse while driving cattle east, was marked by a series of landmarks that became familiar to thousands of travelers. Independence Rock Inn, Wyoming, Chimney Rock in Nebraska, and Scotts Bluff were waypoints that marked progress along the trail and provided focal points for the scattered wagon trains that slowly made their way across the continent. Life in the gold camps was characterized by extremes of hope and disappointment, wealth and poverty. Civilization and lawlessness. The camps themselves were usually temporary affairs, clusters of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings that could spring up almost overnight when gold was discovered, and disappear just as quickly when they were played out or proved to be less abundant than originally hoped. The actual work of gold mining was far different from the romanticized image that drew so many to the West. Placer mining, the most common form of gold extraction, involved long hours of backbreaking work, standing in cold streams and panning gravel in hopes of finding a few tiny flakes of the precious metal. The more elaborate operations used rockers, sluices, and eventually hydraulic equipment to process larger amounts of material, but the basic principle remained the same: sorting through tons of sand and gravel to find the occasional nugget or flake of gold. Most miners never struck it rich. The few did find substantial amounts of gold, often lost their fortunes as quickly as they had gained them, either through gambling, drinking, poor investments, or simple bad luck. The real money in many gold camps was often made by those who sold supplies and services to the miners, merchants, saloon keepers, restaurant operators, and others who provided the necessities and luxuries that the miners demanded. The merchants who followed the gold rushes were often more successful than the miners themselves. They understood that men desperate for news from home would pay premium prices for newspapers that were weeks or months old, that miners working in cold mountain streams would pay almost any amount for warm, well-prepared food, and that the social isolation of camp life created a market for entertainment and companionship that could be very profitable for those willing to provide it. The boom and bust cycle of mining towns created a unique pattern of settlement in the American West. Towns that had populations of 10 or 20,000 people could be virtually abandoned within a few years when the gold played out, leaving behind empty buildings, abandoned equipment, and the dreams of those who had hoped to make their fortunes in the mountains and valleys of the Western territories. Some mining camps evolved into permanent communities, particularly those that were located in areas with other economic advantages, such as good agricultural land, timber resources, or strategic positions along transportation routes. These towns often became regional centers that outlasted the original gold discoveries, serving the ranchers, farmers, and other settlers who came after miners had moved on to new strikes in other parts of the West. The environmental impact of gold mining was often severe and long-lasting. Hydraulic mining, in particular, could strip away entire hillsides and choke streams with sediment, changing the landscape in ways that were visible decades later. The chemicals used in some extraction processes contaminated water supplies and left behind toxic residues that affected both human and animal populations. Yet the gold rushes served an important role in the development of the American West, providing the initial economic incentive that drew large numbers of people to regions that might otherwise have remained sparsely populated for many more years. The infrastructure developed to support the mining, camps, roads, telegraph lines, and eventually railroads, served the ranchers and farmers who came later, and the experience gained by thousands of people in dealing with the challenges of Western life contributed to the overall success of westward expansion. The legends and stories that grew up around the gold rushes became an integral part of Western mythology. Tales of lucky strikes and overnight fortunes, of honest miners cheated by claim jumpers and corrupt officials, of boom towns that appeared and disappeared like mirages in the desert, all contributed to the romantic image of the American West that persists to this day, the social heart of frontier towns. In the scattered communities that dotted the western landscape, the saloon occupied a unique and important position as the primary social center, meeting place, and source of entertainment for cowboys, miners, merchants, and other frontier inhabitants. Far from being simply places where men went to drink alcohol, saloons served multiple functions that made them essential to the social and economic life of frontier communities. The typical frontier saloon was a modest establishment, usually consisting of a single large room with a bar along one wall, a few tables and chairs scattered about, and perhaps a small raised platform where traveling entertainers might perform. The bar itself was often just a plank or was supported by barrels or sawhorses, though more established saloons might invest in elaborate mahogany bars shipped from back east, complete with mirrors and decorative glass. The bartender, often called the barkeep, was frequently one of the most informed people in town, as his position allowed him to hear news, gossip, and information from the constant stream of travelers, cowboys, and local residents who frequented his establishment. Many bartenders served as informal bankers, holding money and valuables for customers who had no other safe place to store their possessions, and some even cashed checks and provided simple financial services. The drinks served in frontier saloons were usually simple and practical. Whiskey was the most common alcoholic beverage, often of questionable quality and frequently diluted with water to increase profits. Beer was less common, as it was more difficult to transport and store without refrigeration, though some saloons in larger towns managed to keep a supply on hand. Many establishments also served coffee, which was often in high demand among cowboys and other workers who needed to stay alert for long hours. Food service was another important function of many saloons. The free lunch, a tradition that became common in many Western drinking establishments, typically consisted of simple fare such as crackers, cheese, pickled eggs, and cold cuts. The salt in these foods naturally made customers thirsty, encouraging them to purchase more drinks. But the free lunch also provided a valuable service to working men who might not otherwise have access to prepared food during their time in town. Entertainment in frontier saloons was usually modest and informal. A piano, if the establishment could afford one and find someone to play it, might provide music for singing or dancing. Card games were common, ranging from simple poker games among friends to more serious gambling that could involve significant amounts of money. Some saloons hosted traveling performers, musicians, actors, storytellers, and other entertainers who made their living moving from town to town along the frontier. The social dynamics of saloon life reflected the broader characteristics of frontier society. These establishments served men from all walks of life and social backgrounds, creating a democratic atmosphere where a wealthy rancher might find himself drinking alongside a common cowhand or drifting laborer. This mixing of social classes was less common in the more established communities of the East, where social distinctions were more rigidly maintained. However, saloons were not entirely inclusive. Women were generally not welcome as customers, except for those who worked in the entertainment industry, and racial segregation was unfortunately common, with separate establishments serving different ethnic communities. These limitations reflected the prejudices and social conventions of the time, rather than any inherent characteristic of frontier life. The business of running a saloon required a combination of entrepreneurial skill, social intelligence, and physical courage. Saloon keepers had to manage their inventory carefully, since supplies often had to be transported over long distances and were subject to spoilage and theft. They needed to maintain order among their customers, some of whom might be carrying weapons and operating under the influence of alcohol. And they had to stay informed about local politics and economics, since changes in these areas could dramatically affect their business. Many saloons serve as informal employment centers where ranchers looking for cowboys could find, men seeking work, where mining companies could recruit laborers, and where various other business arrangements could be made. The bulletin boards found in most saloons carried notices about job, opportunities, lost livestock, items for sale, and other information of interest to the local community. The architecture of frontier saloons was typically simple and functional, designed to be built quickly and economically from whatever materials were available locally. Most were wood-frame structures with false fronts that made them appear larger and more impressive than they actually were. The interiors were usually furnished with whatever tables, chairs, and other equipment could be obtained, often a mixture of styles and qualities that reflected the practical approach to frontier life. The economic impact of saloons on frontier communities was significant. They provided employment not only for bartenders, but also for suppliers, entertainers, cleaning staff, and others who served the establishments. They generated tax revenue for local governments and served as gathering places where business deals could be negotiated and community decisions could be discussed and debated. As frontier communities grew and became more established, many saloons evolved along with them, adding more sophisticated furnishings, expanding their food service, and developing regular entertainment programs. Some became hotels, restaurants, or meeting halls, adapting to the changing needs of their communities as the rough frontier period gave way to more settled and civilized conditions. Notable figures of the Western frontier. The American West produced a remarkable array of individuals whose lives and exploits became the stuff of legend, though the reality of their experiences was often quite different from the romanticized versions that later appeared in books, movies, and popular culture. These men and women were products of their time and circumstances, dealing with the unique challenges and opportunities presented by life on the frontier. Among the most famous of the Western figures were the town marshals and sheriffs who attempted to maintain law and order in communities that were often far from established legal institutions. These lawmen faced the difficult task of enforcing regulations and settling disputes in places where the nearest court might be hundreds of miles away, and where many of the residents were armed and accustomed to settling their own problems without outside interference. Wild Bill Hickok was one such lawman, serving as a sheriff and marshal in several Kansas towns during the height of the cattle drive era. Hickok was known for his skill with firearms and his willingness to face down troublemakers, but he was also a complex individual who worked as a scout, gambler, and performer at various times in his life. His career illustrates the fluid nature of frontier occupations, where men often move from one job to another as circumstances and opportunities changed. Wyatt Earp was another famous lawman whose career spanned several decades and numerous Western communities. Earp worked as a police officer in Wichita and Dodge City, Kansas, before moving to Tombstone, Arizona, where he became involved in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Like many frontier figures, Earp engaged in various occupations throughout his life, including farming, railroad, construction, saloon keeping, and mining. Bat Masterson represented another type of frontier figure, combining careers as a lawman, gambler, buffalo hunter, and eventually a newspaper writer and sports journalist. Masterson's life demonstrated the opportunities for social mobility that existed on the frontier, where a person's background was often less important than his current abilities and accomplishments. On the other side of the law were various outlaws and bandits who preyed on the wealth and commerce that flowed through frontier communities. Jesse James and his brother Frank led a gang that robbed banks and trains throughout the Midwest and border states. Following the Civil War, their exploits captured the public imagination, though the reality of their crimes was often harsh and violent rather than romantic or adventurous. Belle Starr was one of the few female outlaws who achieved widespread notoriety during the frontier. Born Myra Belle Shirley, she became associated with various outlaw gangs and was known for her skill with horses and firearms. Her story illustrates the unconventional opportunities that frontier life sometimes offered to women, though her choices ultimately led to an early and violent death. The cattle barons who built vast ranching empires across the western plains represented another category of notable frontier figures. These men, such as Charles Goodnight in Texas and John Iliff in Colorado, combined vision, business acumen, and physical courage to establish operations that covered hundreds of thousands of acres and employed hundreds of cowboys and other workers. Charles Goodnight was particularly innovative in his approach to ranching, developing new techniques for managing cattle on the open range and establishing some of the first major cattle trails that connected Texas ranches with markets in the north. His partnership with Oliver Loving created the famous Goodnight Loving Trail, which became one of the most important routes for moving cattle from Texas to railroad connections in Colorado and Wyoming. These cattle barons faced enormous challenges in building their operations. They had to secure grazing rights to vast areas of land, often through complex negotiations with federal and territorial governments, local communities, and sometimes hostile Native American tribes. They needed to recruit and maintain large crews of skilled cowboys, manage complex financial operations that might involve credit and investment from Eastern banks, and deal with the constant threats posed by weather, disease, and market fluctuations. The Buffalo Soldiers, African American cavalry regiments that served in the Western territories following the Civil War, played a crucial role in the military histories of the frontier. These professional soldiers earned the respect of both their military superiors and their adversaries for their skill, courage, and discipline. They served at remote frontier posts, participated in campaigns against hostile tribes, and helped to establish and maintain the peace that allowed civilian settlement to proceed. Among the most famous of the frontier scouts and guides was Kit Carson, whose knowledge of Western geography and Native American cultures made him invaluable to military expeditions, surveying parties, and civilian travelers. Carson's career spanned several decades and included service as a trapper, guide, Indian agent, and military officer. His life illustrates the importance of cross-cultural understanding and adaptation in frontier society. The photographers and artists who documented frontier life created an invaluable record of this unique period in American history. William Henry Jackson's photographs of the Western landscape and frontier communities provided many Americans with their first visual images of the territories beyond the Mississippi River. His work, along with that of other frontier photographers, helped to shape public perception of the West and influence government policy regarding Western development. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Jane Canary, became one of the most famous female figures of the frontier, though much of her reputation was based on exaggerated or entirely fictional accounts of her exploits. She worked as a scout, lived in various mining camps and frontier towns, and became known for her unconventional behavior and colorful personality. Her story reflects both the opportunities for women to live independently on the frontier and the tendency for a frontier society to create larger-than-life legends around its more colorful characters. The Native American leaders who dealt with the challenges of westward expansion represented another important category of frontier figures. These men and women faced the enormous task of protecting their peoples and ways of life while adapting to the dramatic changes brought by white settlement, railroad construction, and the decimation of the buffalo herds that formed the basis of Plains Indian economy and culture. Chief Red Cloud of the Lakota Sioux successfully led his people in a war against the U.S. Army over access to traditional hunting grounds in Wyoming and Montana. His victory in Red Cloud's war forced the government to abandon several military posts and recognize Sioux rights to a large reservation in the Black Hills region. However, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills later led to renewed conflict and the eventual reduction of Sioux territory. Sitting Bull, another prominent Lakota leader, became famous for his role in the victory over Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. This battle, while a significant tactical victory for the combined Sioux and Cheyenne forces, ultimately led to increased military pressure and the eventual confinement of the tribes to reservations. These individuals, both famous and obscure, contributed to the complex tapestry of frontier life. Their stories remind us that the American West was populated by real people facing real challenges, making difficult decisions under extraordinary circumstances, and adapting as best they could to a rapidly changing world. The Iron Horse changes everything. The arrival of the railroad in the American West marked the beginning of the end of the classic frontier period, though this transformation occurred gradually over several decades rather than all at once. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory Summit, Utah, represented one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century and fundamentally altered the economic, social, and cultural landscape of the Western Territories. The construction of the railroad itself was an epic undertaking that required the labor of tens of thousands of workers, including many Irish and Chinese immigrants who faced dangerous working conditions, harsh weather, and sometimes hostile reactions from local populations. The Chinese workers, who built the Central Pacific Line eastward from California, faced particularly challenging conditions as they blasted through the granite cliffs of the Sierra Nevada mountains, often working suspended on ropes over sheer precipices while handling explosives in freezing temperatures. The impact of the railroad on the cattle industry was profound and immediate. Before the rails reached the western plains, cattle had to be driven hundreds of miles overland to reach markets, a process that was expensive, time-consuming, and resulted in significant weight loss for the animals. The railroad allowed cattlemen to ship their herds directly to eastern markets, dramatically reducing transportation costs and time while ensuring that the cattle arrived in better condition. Railroad towns sprang up along the new lines, many of them beginning as simple depot stops and construction camps, but quickly evolving into commercial centers that serve the surrounding agricultural and ranching communities. These towns followed a similar pattern of development, a railroad depot, and freight yard formed the center of activity, surrounded by businesses that catered to travelers and shipped goods to and from the surrounding area. Dodge City, Kansas, became one of the most famous of these railroad towns, serving as a shipping point for cattle drives coming up from Texas. During the peak years of the cattle trade, Dodge City was a rough and tumble community where cowboys who had spent months on the trail came to celebrate, spend their wages, and enjoy the amenities of civilization before heading back south for another drive. The railroad also made it possible for farmers to settle in areas that had previously been considered unsuitable for agriculture due to their distance from markets. Wheat, corn, and other crops could now be shipped economically to eastern cities, and farming families could receive manufactured goods, lumber, and other necessities that had previously been either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. However, the expansion of agriculture often came at the expense of the open-range cattle industry. Farmers began fencing their land with the newly invented barbed wire, creating barriers that interfered with traditional cattle driving routes and grazing areas. This led to conflicts between cattlemen and farmers, known as range wars, as both groups competed for control of the same land and water resources. The railroad brought other changes as well. Mail service became faster and more reliable, allowing Western communities to maintain better communication with the rest of the country. Newspapers and magazines arrived more quickly, helping to reduce the intellectual isolation that had been one of the hardships of frontier life. Eastern manufacturers could ship their products west more easily, providing Western consumers with a greater variety of goods at lower prices. The passenger service offered by the railroads made travel to the West faster, safer, and more comfortable than the previous options of stagecoach or wagon train. This encouraged migration by families and individuals who might not have been willing to undertake the hardships of overland travel, leading to more rapid settlement and development of Western communities. The railroad companies themselves became major economic and political forces in the Western territories and states. They owned vast amounts of land that had been granted to them by the federal government to encourage construction, and they used this land for development, farming, and resource extraction. Railroad executives often wielded significant political influence, working to shape government policies in ways that would benefit their operations. Mining operations were also transformed by railroad access, or that had previously been too low grade. To justify the expense of transportation could now be shipped economically to smelters and refineries, leading to the development of new mining districts and the expansion of existing ones. The railroad made it possible to transport heavy mining equipment to remote locations, enabling more sophisticated and efficient extraction methods. The buffalo, which had been a central element of Plains Indian culture and a source of food and materials for white settlers and traders, began to disappear rapidly as professional hunters used the railroad to ship hides and meat to eastern markets. This commercial hunting, combined with the disruption of traditional migration patterns caused by railroad construction, led to the near extinction of the great buffalo herds within just a few decades. For the cowboys whose way of life had been built around the long cattle drives, the railroad represented both opportunity and challenge. While it provided new markets and reduced transportation costs, it also reduced the demand for their traditional skills and services. Many cowboys found work with the railroad. Companies are adapted to the changing conditions by taking jobs on ranches that focus on breeding and raising cattle rather than long-distance driving. the social impact of the railroad was equally significant. Western communities became less isolated and more connected to national trends and developments. Eastern visitors could now travel west more easily, bringing new ideas, customs, and expectations that gradually changed the character of frontier society. The rough, individualistic culture of the early frontier began to give way to more conventional social patterns as communities grew larger and more stable. Twilight on the Range. As the 19th century drew to a close, the American West was undergoing a transformation that would forever change the character of the region and the way of life that had defined it during the classic frontier period. The open range, which had once stretched unbroken from Texas to Montana, was gradually being divided by fences, plowed under for farming, or subdivided into smaller ranches that could be managed more intensively. The great cattle drives that had defined the cowboy era were becoming less common and less necessary, as railroads extended into formerly remote areas, and as the open range gave way to private ownership of land. The skills that had made the trail-driving cowboy essential to the cattle industry were still valuable, but they were being adapted to new circumstances and new methods of operation. Many of the cowboys who had spent their youth driving cattle up the long trails from Texas found themselves adapting to new roles as the industry changed around them. Some became ranch foremen or managers, using their experience with cattle and horses to oversee more settled operations. Others moved into related fields such as horse training, rodeo performance, or working for the railroad. Companies that were transforming the transportation of livestock. The towns that had grown up around a cattle trade also had to adapt to changing circumstances. Places like Dodge City and Abilene, which had thrived as shipping points for trail herds, gradually evolved into agricultural centers, serving the farming communities that were spreading across the former rangeland. The saloons and gambling halls that catered to free-spending cowboys were replaced by more conventional businesses serving the needs of settled families. The weather patterns of the late 1880s contributed significantly to the end of the open range era, a series of harsh winters, particularly the devastating winter of 1886 to 1887, killed millions of cattle across the northern plains. Cowboys found themselves riding through blizzards, trying desperately to find and save animals that were freezing and starving in the brutal cold. The losses were so severe that many large ranching operations were ruined, and investors began to question the wisdom of allowing cattle to range freely through the winter months. This economic disaster led to changes in ranching practices that reduced the demand for traditional cowboy skills. Ranchers began keeping smaller herds that could be fed through the winter months, building barns and storing hay to ensure that their animals could survive harsh weather. This more intensive approach to cattle raising required different skills and fewer workers than the old open range system. The federal government also played a role in ending the open range era through policies that encouraged homesteading and farming. The Homestead Act and similar legislation made it possible for individuals and families to claim ownership of land that had previously been used for cattle grazing. As more and more of the rangeland was converted to private ownership, the traditional patterns of cattle driving became increasingly difficult to maintain. Barbed wire, invented in the 1870s, became the symbol of the changing West. This simple but effective technology made it economical for farmers and small ranchers to fence large areas of land, creating barriers that interfered with the movement of cattle and the traditional activities of cowboys. The invention and widespread adoption of barbed wire probably did more to end the open range era than any other single factor. Yet the transformation of the West was not simply a matter of old ways giving way to new. Many of the values and characteristics that had defined frontier society continued to influence Western culture long after the classic frontier period had ended. The emphasis on individual initiative, the willingness to take risks, the adaptation to challenging environmental conditions, and the informal democratic social relationships that had characterized frontier communities all became enduring elements of Western identity. The cowboy himself, while no longer as essential to the cattle industry as he had once been, began to take on a new role as a symbol of American independence and adventure. Even as the reality of cowboy, life was changing. The image of the cowboy was being romanticized in popular literature, Wild West shows, and eventually in movies and television programs. This romanticized version of the cowboy often bore little resemblance to the working reality of cattle handling, but it captured something important about the American spirit and the appeal of frontier life. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured throughout the United States and Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, played a significant role in creating and popularizing the romantic image of the American West. Cody's show featured demonstrations of cowboy skills, Indian, dancing, sharpshooting, and other frontier activities, presenting them as entertainment for audiences who had never experienced life on the actual frontier. The environmental consequences of the frontier period were becoming apparent by the 1890s. The near extinction of the buffalo, the overgrazing of rangeland, the pollution caused by mining operations, and the disruption of natural ecosystems by farming and railroad construction all pointed to the need for more careful management of natural resources. This recognition would eventually lead to the conservation movement and the establishment of national parks and forests to preserve some of the Western landscape in its natural state. Native American tribes, who had seen their traditional ways of life disrupted by westward expansion, were adapting to life on reservations and trying to maintain their cultural identity while dealing with government policies that often sought to eliminate tribal customs and languages. The end of the frontier period marked the beginning of a new and equally challenging phase in the relationship between Native Americans and the expanding United States. Under the endless sky, as evening settles over the vast expanse of the western plains, the sky begins its daily transformation into a canvas of colors that seems too beautiful to be real. The sun, hanging low on the horizon like a great orange ball, casts long shadows across the grassland and bathes everything in a warm, golden light that makes even the humblest prairie flower seem precious and significant. The cowboy sits quietly beside a small campfire, the flames flickering gently in the evening breeze that carries the scent of sage and wild grass across the endless miles of open country. His horse, hobbled nearby, grazes contentedly on the native grasses that have sustained the herds of buffalo and cattle that have crossed these plains for generations. The sound of the animal pulling and chewing the grass creates a peaceful, rhythmic accompaniment to the soft whisper of wind through the prairie. Above, the sky continues its slow progression through the spectrum of colors that marks the end of another day on the range. The orange of the setting sun gradually gives way to deeper shades of red and purple, while the first stars begin to appear in the darkening eastern sky. The evening star, bright and steady, appears just above the horizon, a familiar companion to countless cowboys who have sat by similar fires and watched similar sunsets across the years. The fire crackles softly, sending occasional sparks dancing upward into the cooling air. The cowboy adds another piece of dried wood to the flames, not because he needs more heat, but because the fire provides companionship and comfort in the vast solitude of the prairie night. The coffee pot sits at the edge of the coals, the dark liquid inside still warm from the evening meal, ready to provide one last cup before sleep comes. The sounds of the evening are subtle but distinct to ears trained by years of listening to the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls, its voice rising and falling in the ancient song that has echoed across these plains since long before the first white settlers arrived. Other coyotes answer from different directions, creating a chorus that speaks of the wildlife that still exists in the spaces between human settlements. The wind shifts slightly, bringing new scents and sounds. The rustle of grass, the distant lowing of cattle, settling for the night, the soft hoot of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. These are the sounds that have lulled cowboys to sleep for decades, the natural symphony of the western night that never completely repeats itself but always maintains its essential character of peace and solitude. As full darkness approaches, the stars become more numerous and brilliant. The Milky Way begins to appear as a faint river of light stretching across the sky from one horizon to the other. Cowboys learned to navigate by these stars, using them as a compass during night herding and as a calendar to mark the passage of seasons. The Big Dipper, the North Star, and the constellation Orion become familiar friends to men who spent so many nights under the open sky. The cowboy rolls out his bedding, a simple affair consisting of blankets and a ground cloth that will provide basic comfort on the earth floor of his bedroom. He removes his boots and places them carefully beside his bed, ready to be pulled on quickly if the need should arise during the night. His hat remains within easy reach, and his gun belt hangs from the saddle that serves as his pillow and protects his most valuable possessions. The fire burns lower now, the flames settling into a steady glow that will provide warmth through the cool hours before dawn. The coffee pot is moved away from the direct heat, but remains close enough to the coals that will still be warm when morning comes, and the day's work begins again. The horse moves quietly in the darkness, the sound of its movement and breathing a reassuring presence. In the night, the relationship between the cowboy and his horse was one of mutual dependence and trust, developed through countless hours of working together in all kinds of weather and circumstances. Many cowboys felt more comfortable sleeping within earshot of their horses than in the finest hotel room in the most civilized town. Sleep comes gradually to the cowboy, not all at once, but in stages as the tensions and concerns of the day slowly fade away. The last conscious sounds he hears are the soft whisper of wind through the grass, the distant call of night birds, and the gentle crackling of the dying fire. These sounds blend together into a lullaby that has sung countless men to sleep under the wide western sky. The stars will slowly overhead, marking the passage of time in their ancient measured way. The same stars that guided explorers across unknown oceans and helped travelers find their way through trackless wilderness now watch over the sleeping cowboy as they have watched over countless others in the long history of human wandering and adventure. The prairie wind continues its endless journey across the grassland, carrying stories and scents from distant places, connecting the small campfire to all the other fires that burn in the darkness, linking this moment to all the other moments of peace and solitude that have been experienced in this vast and timeless landscape. As the night deepens and the fire burns down to glowing coals, the cowboy sleeps peacefully in his simple bed under the endless canopy of stars, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the prairie night and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring another day of work, another sunset, another night under the wide western sky that has watched over so many dreams and adventures in the great American West. And so the story of the West continues, not in dramatic battles or sudden fortunes, but in the quiet moments of daily life, the steady rhythm of work and rest, the enduring relationship between human beings in the vast landscape they have chosen to call home. The cowboy sleeps, the stars shine, the prairie wind whispers its eternal song, and the great wheel of time turns slowly onward into the peaceful darkness of another western night. The embers of the fire glow softly in the darkness, providing just enough light to reveal the sleeping figure and the peaceful face of his horse standing guard nearby. Tomorrow there will be work to do, cattle to tend, distances to travel, and challenges to meet. But for now, there's only rest, peace, and the infinite tranquility of the western night, where time moves slowly and dreams are filled with endless horizons and the freedom of the open range.